In the bustling city, where people wore perfection like armor and appearance, was currency more valuable than skill, there lived a girl named Mayra, who had never once seen herself as beautiful from the moment she was old enough to understand mirrors. She realized she was not the kind of girl others admired. Her face bore the scars of childhood burns. Her nose slightly crooked from an accident, and her eyes, though intelligent, were often hidden behind thick glasses. Her classmates laughed when she raised her hand. Her teachers pitied her more than they praised her, and society quietly assigned her a place far from the spotlight. But Mayra was not a girl to accept fate so easily. She buried herself in books while others chased validation. She learned the art of coding, the science of business, the psychology of marketing, and the power of silence. She graduated with the highest distinction, but even then, during job interviews, she saw the same flicker in the eyes of recruiters, that silent judgment that said, "Not you, not like this," and yet she didn't quit. Instead, she applied to one of the most prestigious companies in the country. Titan Corp, a name synonymous with power, innovation, and ruthlessness. Its CEO, Aiden Riemann, was a man who had risen from nothing and now ruled everything he was known for: his perfectionism, his cold eyes, his obsession with image and control. He was the kind of man who could look at a room full of Harvard graduates and say, "None of you are good enough," because he saw beyond degrees. He wanted instinct, hunger, and vision, but no one expected that this time he'd find it in someone like her. When Mayra walked into the waiting area of Titan Corp's final interview round, the room fell. Silent, not because of admiration, but discomfort. There were whispers. Why is she here? How did she even make it past round? One look at her, she doesn't even try to look presentable. She had worn a clean, simple outfit, her mother's ironed cotton kurta, and tied her hair back. She carried a portfolio in her worn leather bag and sat alone while others compared branded suits and expensive watches. One by one, candidates were called in. They exited with forced smiles, nervous laughter, and slowly the room thinned until only Mayra remained. The receptionist gave her a glance that said, "They probably forgot you." But before she could ask, a tall man in a navy suit stepped out, holding her file. His eyes scanned her face, not with mockery, but curiosity. And he said, "Mayra Zahid, please follow me." She stood, walked with calm steps, her heart pounding, and was led into a glass room with an unobstructed view of the city. There he sat, Aiden Riemann himself, staring out the window like a statue carved from stone. Without looking at her, he said, "You don't look like any candidate I've seen today," she replied. "Perhaps that's a good thing." He turned. Then his gaze sharp, but intrigued. "Sit," he said, and she did. And what followed was not a typical interview. He didn't ask about her GPA or previous jobs. He said, "What would you do if my company lost half its value in a scandal tomorrow?" She replied with clarity, "I'd rebuild, not from the image up, but from the inside out. People forgive mistakes, they don't forgive arrogance." He narrowed his eyes and said, "If I handed you a failing department, what's the first thing you'd fix?" She said, "The people. Broken teams create broken products. No innovation survives without trust." She spoke with a calm fire, her voice unshaken by his intimidating presence. And then he asked, "What do you think of yourself when you look in the mirror?" And for a second, silence hung heavy in the air. She met his gaze and said, "I see a survivor. I see someone who wasn't meant to make it, but I don't see beauty. I see strength." His expression didn't change, but something in the air did, a slight shift in weight. A pause in his breath. He stood and walked to the window again, then said, "Thank you." That's all. She left unsure if she had impressed or insulted him. The days passed, and she heard nothing until one evening a black car pulled up outside her modest home, and a man stepped out with a letter bearing Titan Corp's golden seal. Inside was a single line: "Report to the office Monday morning, 9 a.m., signed Aiden Riemann." She showed up nervous, uncertain, and was led not to the HR department, not to a desk in the corner, but to the executive floor, where a sleek nameplate was waiting to be installed. It bore her name, and underneath it the title, Executive Director, Special Projects. The office buzzed with disbelief. Who is she? What is she doing here? But Aiden ignored every murmur and handed her files that others couldn't handle, gave her problems others had failed to solve, and she delivered again and again. Her ideas saved millions. Her insight revived broken systems, and slowly, even the skeptics began to watch her with reluctant admiration yet. Whispers of her appearance never ceased in boardrooms. In corridors, even in newspapers, there were articles suggesting her rise was a mystery. Some hinted at pity, some even darker motives, but Aiden remained silent, and she remained focused. And one night, as the company prepared for its biggest international partnership, a crisis erupted. The media caught wind of a data breach. Investors panicked and the company's stocks threatened to nosedive. An emergency meeting was called, and every executive gave excuses. Plans, half-baked solutions, but Mara stepped up with a plan so bold, so transparent that silence fell in the room. She said, "We admit it. We fix it publicly. We show them we care about people more than image." Aiden looked around at his shaken team and then said, "Implement her plan that night." She worked past midnight, and when the crisis passed, and Titan Corp not only survived, but was praised for its honesty. Aiden called her into his office, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "I've built this empire on strength and courage, and today, you reminded me what that looks like." He paused, then said, "When I hired you, people called me mad. When you succeeded, they said. I was lucky, but I know the truth. I saw in you what they refused to see." And he opened a drawer, placed a document before her, and it read Acting CEO, and his neat signature Mara Zahid, and her hands trembled as she held it. The girl they once called ugly now sat at the helm of one of the world's most powerful corporations, not because of her looks, but because of her soul, her fire, and the one man who chose to see past the mask, the World War asterisk. The news spread like wildfire across the corporate world. The girl once mocked for her appearance now held the highest seat of power after the founder himself, and while headlines tried to sensationalize her story, focusing on her looks or calling her the unlikely CEO, Mara stayed rooted in the one thing that had always guided her. Her work, the building she once walked into as a candidate, now rose before her every morning as her responsibility. Every floor, every department, every trembling voice that feared the next crisis was now her concern. She walked in not with the swagger of power, but with the quiet command of someone who had earned every step through fire. She replaced stiff formalities with open communication, introduced weekly open door hours where anyone from janitors to engineers could walk in and speak to her directly. She didn't bring a dramatic makeover, nor did she adopt the language of corporate kings. She remained herself, soft-spoken, but decisive, humble, but unshakable. And the employees who had once whispered behind her back slowly began to admire her, not because she demanded it, but because she gave something no other leader had ever given them: a sense of belonging. But not everyone was pleased. Her rise among the top brass were those who felt threatened by her presence, those who believed a woman like her had no place leading a company that stood for status, innovation, and perfection. One of them was Zayan, the senior VP of Global Strategy. A man known for his charm, ruthless ambition, and an ego that towered above the skyline. He had expected to be named acting CEO, and when Mara took the chair, he smiled in public, but plotted in silence. He began to undermine her decisions, challenged her at board meetings, twisted her words, and quietly fed stories to the media, painting her as incompetent. But Mara had not survived her past to be shaken by petty games. She responded not with confrontation, but with clarity every time he tried to sabotage her project. She came back with results every time he tried to discredit her. She responded with proof every lie he planted. She uprooted with grace and reason, and the board noticed slowly but surely the narrative began to shift. Investors who once questioned her began to publicly support her, and employees began to speak of her leadership with admiration and pride. Then came the day of the annual summit, where CEOs from around the globe gathered and the world watched with bated breath. Titan Corp was expected to announce its next big leap, and all eyes were on Mara as she stepped onto the stage wearing a modest navy suit, her scars still visible, her glasses still in place, but her presence radiant with quiet strength. She spoke not of numbers, not of dominance or profit, but of rebuilding business with heart. She talked about ethical AI, sustainable development, inclusive hiring, and turning corporations into communities. Her words were not flashy, but they moved people. The crowd rose in applause, and later, as she stepped off stage, a renowned journalist caught up to her and said, "You've changed the definition of leadership." With tears in her eyes, she replied, "I didn't change it, I just remembered what it was always." Meant to be back at Titan Corp, Zayan made his final move. He fabricated a report suggesting Mayra had misused funds and leaked it anonymously to the press's storm. Corrupted calls flooded and news channels swarmed the gates, and the board called for an emergency review. Aiden, who had been abroad, rushed back and watched silently as the media tore into Mayra. But she sat calmly, reviewed the accusations, and called for a full transparent audit. She made every transaction public, called for an independent committee, and said, "If I am guilty, I will resign, and if I am not, I expect the same courage from those who doubted me." The audit took 2 weeks, during which her name was dragged. Her past mocked her appearance, once again became the center of every debate, but she walked into the office every day, looked every colleague in the eye, and continued to lead until finally the report came in. Not only was she innocent, but the committee found that the manipulated documents were linked to Zayan's assistant. Aiden called a meeting the next morning where Zayan sat pale and shaking, and Aiden said, "You tried to destroy a woman who built this company. Brick by brick, with nothing but integrity and resilience. You don't belong here." And without another word, Zayan was dismissed. But even then, Mayra didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She walked out of that room and went straight to her team, thanked them for standing by her, and reminded them that the company wasn't built by her alone, but by every hand that dared to believe in change. That weekend, she visited her childhood home, where her mother still lived in the same small flat filled with books and memories, and sat beside her mother holding her hands and said, "You once told me the world may never be kind, but it cannot take your worth unless you give it away, and I never did." Her mother smiled with pride and said, "I didn't raise a beautiful girl, I raised an unstoppable one." Meanwhile, across the city, young girls watched her speeches. Women submitted resumes to companies they once feared, and students who felt invisible found hope in her journey. She had become more than a CEO. She had become a symbol of silent strength, and when Aiden finally stepped down a few months later, after officially naming her the permanent CEO, he said in his farewell note to the board, "I built this empire, but she gave it a soul." Mayra stood before the entire company during the transition, thanked Aiden for his faith, and promised to lead, not from above, but from within. And that night, as she stood alone in her office, looking out at the city lights, she remembered the first time she saw this skyline from a taxi window years ago, wondering if someone like her could ever belong in that world. And now she was not just part of it, she was leading it. Not because the world suddenly became kinder, but because she never let it convince her she didn't belong. Her journey was not about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about proving herself right every single day. She chose not to shrink when they mocked her, not to hide when they doubted her, not to break when they tried to bury her. And now she had become something they never expected, not a beautiful face, not a corporate puppet, but a revolution wrapped in grace. And if there was one thing she had learned through it all, it was that real power never shouts. It just stands tall and keeps walking. The morning was still as Mayra stood by the large window of her office, her eyes scanning the skyline that once felt unreachable. Now it was hers, not by conquest, but by quiet endurance, not by inheritance, but by intention, yet even with the world finally calling her a leader, with articles praising her mind and documentaries being made about her transformation, she remained untouched by the glamour. Because she knew that leadership was not a throne, it was a mirror. It reflected not how powerful you looked, but how true you stayed to your essence each day. She walked into her office not as a queen, but as a worker, surrounded by people who now looked at her not with judgment, but with belief. Still, she knew deep inside that challenges never disappeared, they simply changed shape, and she had to stay ready for the storm that always followed a season of calm. So when an unexpected letter from the International Investment Board arrived, inviting her to speak at the World Business Convention, she knew it was more than a compliment. It was a test. Only 10 CEOs were selected, and all eyes would be on her every word, every pause, every choice of clothing, every glance, not because she was different, but because she had dared to lead without apologizing for who she was. For days, she prepared not a speech, but a message, something that would not only represent Titan Corp, but also speak for every girl who had ever been told she wasn't enough. she refused the glittering designer offers sent to her, and instead chose to wear her mother's old olive green silk scarf wrapped gently around her shoulders. When the day arrived, she stepped onto the plane alone. No assistants, no entourage. Just a laptop and a folder of handwritten notes. The venue was a towering hall in Geneva lit with grandeur that made even kings feel small. But Mara walked in with a calm breath, her presence not loud but solid as she waited. Backstage, she overheard whispers again. Some were surprised she made the list, others questioned her experience. A few smirked as she passed, but she had heard it all before she stepped onto the stage. Her heart steady, and when the lights dimmed and the spotlight hit, she began not with numbers, not with strategy, but with a story. She told them about her first interview at Titan Corp, about sitting in a room where she was invisible until someone saw her mind. Instead of her face, she spoke of rebuilding. Not just a company, but an entire belief system where success is no longer about appearance, but about authenticity, where leadership is not about charisma, but about courage, where the people who are laughed at today become the ones we follow tomorrow. She didn't try to sound powerful. She spoke with honesty. And in that honesty, there was something so rare that when she finished, the entire room stood in silence before slowly rising into applause. It wasn't loud. It was deep and lasting. When she walked off stage, several CEOs from the crowd approached her, not to talk business, but to say thank you that night. As she returned to her hotel, a young woman at the front desk stopped her and whispered, "You gave me hope. I was going to quit today, but now I won't." And Mara simply smiled because she remembered what it was like to be that girl holding on by a thread days past. And the world reacted. The speech went viral. Investors poured in. People called her the voice of a new era. But back at Titan Corp, another challenge was rising in the shadows. A powerful multinational firm, Argentum Global, was attempting a silent takeover of smaller departments within Titan Corp, offering backdoor deals to senior managers, trying to weaken the company from within without declaring war. They believed Mara would never see it coming because she was too young, too soft, too idealistic. But they didn't realize that behind her quiet exterior was a strategist, trained by survival, sharpened by rejection, and seasoned by every storm she had endured. She began to notice inconsistencies, reports that didn't match, numbers that danced just out of reach, until one night she stayed in the office till dawn, tracing patterns herself. And what she uncovered shook her but didn't surprise her. She called a meeting with her executive team and laid out the map of betrayal, not with anger, but with evidence. She gave everyone present a chance to come clean. Two did the rest denied, and when she looked into their eyes and said, "Loyalty cannot be bought, it must be felt," they understood their time was over. She restructured the entire internal security system, built a new ethical board, and invited external monitors to observe every operation. The stock price dipped briefly as the news went public, but then something miraculous happened. Customers rallied behind her. Employees from other companies sent in applications stating they wanted to work where truth mattered, even when it hurt. Titan Corp not only recovered, it soared, and for the first time in history, an employee-led initiative was passed into company law, making transparency and shared leadership a permanent part of its constitution. Months passed, and with each day, Mara became not only a CEO, but a movement. People wrote to her from around the world, women who had been overlooked, students who had been bullied, disabled individuals who were told they'd never make it, and each time she replied not with sympathy but with encouragement. She launched a global mentorship program called Vision, within pairing unheard voices with leaders across industries. And one evening, as she sat reviewing a proposal, a small package arrived at her desk, wrapped in brown paper, and inside was a photo of a 10-year-old girl with burn marks on her cheek. In a letter that read, "I used to cry when I saw my face in the mirror. Now I smile because I know maybe one day I can be like you." And Mara held that photo to her chest and wept, not out of sadness, but out of recognition of the full circle of a life once broken, now helping others build theirs. But her journey still had one unfinished chapter. Aiden Remen, the man who had first seen her fire, had quietly disappeared from the public eye after his retirement. No one knew where he had gone, but Mara had always wanted to thank him, not just for the position, but for the belief. So she asked around quietly, and after months of searching, she found him in a small coastal village, where he had opened a school for orphaned children far from the cameras, far from the skyscrapers. She visited him unannounced and found him sitting under a tree, teaching math to a group of barefoot kids. When he looked up and saw her, he smiled that rare smile that once made boardrooms freeze and said, "I knew you'd come." And she sat beside him in the dirt, not in a suit, not with files, just as Mayra, the girl he had once chosen for a reason even he couldn't explain. They spoke of the past, the mistakes, the wins, the moments they both doubted themselves. And when she asked him why he chose her that day, he said, "Because you didn't try to impress me, you just told the truth, and I knew truth like that can either destroy a company or save it, and you chose to save it." She left that village with a heart full of peace, and as she returned to the city, she made a decision to build a new branch of Titan Corp in that very village and use the profits to fund education and innovation for forgotten children, because her story was never meant to end in a tower. It was meant to rise from the ground up and give roots to others. Like her, years passed, and the world changed, and leadership changed, and in every major conversation about business ethics, about courage, about inclusion, her name was mentioned. Not as a miracle, but as proof that the human spirit is stronger than perception and more enduring than judgment. One day, a journalist interviewing her asked if she would ever consider stepping down, and she laughed gently and said, "I will the day this chair becomes more about power than purpose, and until then, I'll keep showing up. Not because I want to lead, but because someone has to lead." Differently, and somewhere in the corner of the world, a little girl with uneven skin or a broken voice or a different body will hear that and say, "Maybe, just maybe, I can too." And that was her true legacy. Not the title, not the empire, not the billions she helped generate, but the billion unseen hearts she awakened, and the knowledge that real beauty is not in what the world applauds, but in what you do when no one believes you ever could.